Hello and welcome back, and just before we start today's video, just a quick heads up that although this is the review of the F8 SSD Plus, we're also going to be giving one of these away on the NASCompares Inner Circle on Ko-Fi and Patreon very soon. So if you'd like to check that out, there will be links in the description to the giveaway, and also that Terramaster are going to be present at IFA in Berlin that we're going to be covering here on NASCompares later this week, along with a bunch of other brands. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about this later in the week alongside another 4-bay solution they are working on. But with that aside, let's crack on with today's video. Today I want to talk about this. This is the latest flash NAS to enter the market. This is the Terramaster F8 SSD Plus. This is the brand's very first dedicated flash system, prioritizing the use of M2 NVMe's. This is an 8-bay desktop NAS system that I swear it could fit in pretty much any bag you're carrying these days. Rocking out the gate with 10 GBE, rocking out the gate with Gen 3 architecture, and rocking out the gate with 2 different CPUs, going all the way up to an i3 8-core. This is some serious business. Let's face it, in the last 12 to 18 months, flash NASs have sort of become a thing. Whether it is because of the downgrading in pricing of M.2 NVMe's, or the fact that we've started to see more and more CPUs arriving at a nice efficiency level where at the same time they can really handle a decent amount of throughput internally and of course externally. Arriving at $799, this is, I would argue, one of the most interesting flash NAS systems I've talked about here on the channel. Let's be honest, right now, the scores to beat have seemingly been these two. The Ugreen DXB480T, which is the 4-bay model, and the Flash Store series, the Flash Store 6 and 12 Pro, 2 NAS systems that, of course, I'm going to be comparing against very soon. But, you know, affordability in desktop flash NAS systems has, you know, been something of a boon in the last 12 months or so. We've seen more and more systems rocking out, prioritizing and moving towards SSD, and with hard drives, although still very much in the game, let's face it, they're not going anywhere in terms of sheer capacity and price point, M2 NVMe's have become somewhat desirable. And a system like this that is incredibly compact, and I'm not going to say cheap, but I'm going to say very affordable in terms of that price point, is going to have an audience. Now, in terms of accessories and what you get, some things are more interesting than others. The PSU is a 72-watt external PSU. Again, given the size, given the amount of SSDs that have been put inside this system, it makes sense to me that they're not really going to want to have too much heat generated from an internal PSU. On top of that, you get heat sinks. Now, this is something a lot of brands get wrong. They'll include thermal pads. They'll include a bunch of thermal pads to put on your SSDs, and hopefully they'll go ahead and attach to some kind of internal casing. But this system rocks out with 8, I would argue, pretty nice quality M2 NVMe's. They're not the tallest because space is at a premium in this. We'll talk about that later on. But as you can see, they are all metal there all the way through. And you do get the heat dissipating panels as well for the individual slots inside. So it's quite nice that it arrives with all of those. It also arrives with instruction manuals, and they've thrown in kind of a promo package of devices they're working on, and apparently you can get €100 off. Again, it lasts till the 18th of October. I don't know if it's just their own retailer, but again, I recommend you check that out. I'm sure I'll link to it in the description. And that's about it. There's no other accessories. You don't get SSDs included with the system, and the TOS 6 operating system it arrives on a little USB bootloader inside that loads it onto the SSDs that you put inside there. Now, it's a plastic external chassis all the way around with metal all the way through the middle, and cooling is taken care of with 2 base mounted fans here that are quite low noise. Let's cut to the noise. And that was with the system fully populated, with a RAID being created internally and apps being installed on the volume. I disconnected the LAN cable so I wouldn't affect that when I was moving it around, but the system was at about 50 to 60% utilization, and ultimately not too shabby, I would say. Now, on top of that, you've got your ventilation there, all the way along with the power button there. With the ventilation, you can see the main PCB there in the middle. In terms of ports and connections, I would say there on the back, we got some good and we got some bad news. We'll get the blase stuff out of the way. Of course, we've got USB 3.2 Gen 2 there at the top. So you've got a couple of USB 3.2 Gen 2 10 gig A ports and a USB Type-C port. Again, all of them 10 gigabit or 1000 megabytes per second. We've also got an HDMI output. Again, HDMI 2.1, fine. But realistically, because they don't have an HDMI GUI to play with, there's only a limit to how much you can utilize that. And there is 10 gigabit Ethernet out the box. Good stuff, right? Well, we do need to highlight that there is only one. Now, as good as that is, having 10 gig, which realistically, any one of these SSDs at Gen 3 times 1 could probably have fully saturated that for the most part. I would still say only have a single 10G port on this means no failover, no ability to prioritize connections to a lesser connection, no internet input and then 10G network output. It's a real shame, but we have to at least have to acknowledge that because the system's got USB 3.2 Gen 2 up here, we've got enough USBs for our storage, but of course also take advantage of the 2.5 and 5 gigabit network adapters, which can be added to this, which means you can add further connections, but still nonetheless, only having a single 10G out the gate, a little disappointing. Now, if we remove the rear screw, because that keeps the whole thing in place, we can have a little look at the insides. Now, the system arrives with a single SODIMM memory slot, that's DDR5, non-ECC. Again, we'll go back to the CPU. There's going to be definitely some of you that a flash system that's rocking out with 4 M2 NVMe's there and 4 M2 NVMe's there are not going to like the idea of a lack of ECC memory. But if you're going to go for a CPU to keep things affordable, like that N305 or the other CPU, there is an affordable version of this. We'll get to that in a moment. You've only got one slot. You can only go up to 32 gig. But at the very least, this system rocks out the gate with 16 in that pre-built slot there. And although it's not ECC, DDR5 does have on-die ECC, which is not the same thing, but still it's better than nothing. Now, each of the M.2 NVMe slots there are Gen 3 times 1. Terramaster do state this on our own pages, but we went in with SSH, we double checked, and yes, every single one of them is Gen 3 times 1. No further downgrade from there. You can rate them all together, and of course, as mentioned, Gen 3 times 1, 1000 megabytes per second. You're not really going to see that output on a single 10 GBE. You're going to oversaturate that port immediately, but it's about internal operations. Also, having 8 of them means you can create individual sub-pools there. You don't have to have one giant pool. You could have individual pools within TOS. It is a BTRFS and ext4 system. There's no ZFS, but still, that's pretty darn decent. And again, you don't have to fully populate it. You can just put in 1 drive, 2 drive, and gradually add them over time if you choose. No hot swapping, of course. This is an E1S. Now, on top of those 8 slots there, we've got that big old heatsink there. That is where our CPU lives. Now, the CPU on this is, if you go for the Plus series model, it's the Intel N305, an 8-core i3 processor. That's also an 8-thread processor. Has a very low clock speed at 0.8 gigahertz. It can be burst up to 3.8 when needed. That CPU, pretty low TDP, between 9 and 15 watts. And it has to be said that as good as that CPU sounds, it's only 9 lanes to play with. That's the main reason that we've had 8 slots here, all at times 1 speed, and only one 10 GBE. They've had to be very, very tactical about the allocation of those lanes. Now, that CPU, as mentioned, there is a non-Plus version of this, just called the F8 SSD. That arrives with an Intel N95 CPU. Man alive, do you remember the N95 mobile phone? What an absolute beauty. Man, when did that come out? Was that like 5, 10 years ago? Oh man alive, I feel old. And likewise, that N95 CPU has got a 10 to 15 watt TDP and 9 lanes to play with. Both of them rate very highly on CPU benchmark, with the N305 well over 10,000 rating there. So again, a decent little architecture to play with, a decent CPU for things like 4K transcoding, for taking advantage of virtual machines and, you know, bespoke container deployment. And TOS 6 has got a lot to talk about right now. In fact, let's talk about it. Now, TOS 6 is a lot more stylised, I would argue, on Windows 11. You've got this top bar up here, and from here, you've got that start option there. And I've installed pretty much everything for that follow-up video coming soon, but there is a huge range of applications and services to choose from there. I'm not going to say I'm completely in love with the GUI. I mentioned this earlier on when I saw the TOS 6 beta, but as NAS software goes, it is still pretty intuitive. And if you're a Windows 11 user, there's stuff here that you're just going to know where everything's laying out. I'm not overly keen on this bar being at the top and not at the bottom, but you've got this sidebar here to get real-time information about your NAS when it comes to hardware resources and notifications. Alternatively, use the bar to find out more about those notifications one by one. On top of that, you can sort of add very specialized individual notifications as needed whenever you want. And then from there, you've also got options for if you've got attached USB devices, not just storage. And then on top of it, you've got the help and the guidance tab there as well. Now, the settings for the system, again, they've not changed too much in terms of the layout. I will say they've definitely improved the way storage is portrayed on the system. So, for example, in this system here, more information about all the individual hard drives and SSDs are all laid out pretty darn well. The creation of storage pools have been made a little bit clearer, you know, with regards to performance, redundancy, stuff like that. It's all a great deal smoother. And of course, thanks to their support of the T-RAID system, you can use different size drives within single storage arrays. You can do performance benchmarks on the drives, and that all goes all the way down to the M2 NVMEs as well, which can be used for pools and caching. Adding different kinds of USB drives here, you can create USB copies or just mounting the drives if you choose alongside virtual disks, which you can mount remotely utilizing third-party tools. And again, I should add, there is also support of iSCSI creation on this system as well. So if we go into the range of applications on the system, you now do have an iSCSI manager for mounting those storage in pure kind of raw storage buckets for your local OS to treat like it is logical storage. On top of that, support of snapshots has improved, is a great deal more responsive. And as we go through the system, the different applications and services for backing up local synchronization, remote cloud backups, and NAS to NAS and within system backups with TFM, allowing you to mirror different storage areas from within your system live is, you know, surprisingly useful. And as if nothing else has kind of been demonstrated here in the OS, apart from that sad cat in the background, this is a very responsive OS, and that extends, by the way, all the way down to the file manager as well, which again gives you everything you're going to need. Contextual right-click options, copy, paste, archive, create favorites, utilizing some of the metadata and viewing some of that information there. If you want to go ahead and share files, it can all be done from this interface, and that share interface you can add expiration, number of times it can be accessed, who can access it, passwords, the works. On top of that, when we make our way into the settings menu there, we've got options for configuration and control of security. So within the system, you've got the security scanner, you've got that isolation mode, which I love oh so much on Terramaster, protection from DDoS, protection from auto failover if people start getting passwords wrong, certificates which you can apply with Let's Encrypt or their own remote one if you want to use Terramaster's own service. There's a lot for you to get behind here. I will say they've tightened a lot of the user interface of this system, and real-time information is available at any time, again via that side tab or here on the main infrastructure. I would say top to bottom, TOS is probably more feature-rich and smoother and more responsive than it's ever been. And if we look at the applications with regards to multimedia, there's even more to talk about there. From Terraphotos with AI photo recognition there, running there in the background to recognize people and faces, as well as creating shareable spaces for others or utilizing your own multimedia. It's all accessible there, and a lot of those AI services can be enabled, disabled, along with intelligent indexing and setting your own directories there from the user interface. Very, very smoothly indeed. Alternatively, in TOS 6, it's worth highlighting that alongside photos, you've also got now multimedia server for if you want to take advantage of DLNA there, and of course if you want to take advantage of Plex Media Server, they have got quite an updated Plex client there for you to go ahead and enjoy multimedia on your NAS over Plex at any time. And depending on the NAS that you choose to use, that is going to result in a better Plex experience. Of course, the hardware will make all of the difference. I would say the majority of these new 2024-2025 systems, like the F4424 Max and the F8 SSD and SSD Plus, have got some great hardware inside for you to really get behind. Some things could do with a little bit more love, I would say. VirtualBox support on it, although very, very useful, I would still argue isn't as good as having their own inbuilt operating system there for a hypervisor for running VMs. That said, it runs like a charm, and as you can see there, I can go ahead and access our VM while configuring it, if I powered it down, directly from this user interface. It's not perfect, but it's not terrible either. And again, we can make our way into the VM at any time, or start adding other VMs to take advantage of our hardware resources very, very quickly. On top of that, we've got things such as, again, TerraSync and TerraSync Client are still kind of alternative to Synology Drive, but still in beta in places, and they're good. But I would still argue they don't have quite the same range of client tools available for download on the Terramaster client download list as the likes of Synology, but they are closing the gap. Surveillance Manager is still very much in beta, and we covered that in other videos, and I hope more comes of it, but it's still not really what I would call an enterprise-grade surveillance tool at this time. As mentioned, they've massively upgraded things like backups and things like cloud synchronization. And I'd say right now, from cloud sync support in multiple platforms, and by multiple, I mean a lot more than some of the other ones out there, I'm really impressed by just the range with which you can support that offsite cloud sync, mount, or backup. The same goes if you want to create those backup tasks with the NAS to USB, NAS to a remote NAS, or NAS to cloud. The centralized backup tool, although still in beta, is still pretty darn sharp. On top of that, while we make our way forward, we can have a look at the things like the deduplication manager that allows you to scan individual areas within the system manually or on a schedule to remove duplicate files but still keep a record of those original files on the fly. There is a big old range of apps and services here, and I would argue for such a small brand, they've got a lot on offer here within TOS 6. It still has some gaps, and I'm, again, not in love with the new design philosophy. It doesn't feel quite as intuitive as its predecessor, but once I've wrapped my head around it and what they were trying to do, it did grow better on me. But I would say, when it comes to their backup options and a lot of the applications and services, just keep in mind that the development of client tools is still not quite there yet compared with some of the other brands out there. If you're a Windows user or an Android user, you have got everything on offer here in terms of creating your perfect multi-tiered 3-2-1 backup strategy. But if you are on Mac platforms or on Linux platforms there, it's not quite as streamlined, but they are getting there, and a look at their roadmap does show that they are trying. Nevertheless, TOS 6 is still better than it's ever been, although the design, I'm not in love with it, as I say. Let's go back to the studio and summarise today's review. Now, performance-wise, you'll be utterly unsurprised to hear that this, again, largely saturated the 10G connection. We tried Crystal Disk, we tried Atto, we tried AJA, and we did some Windows transfer tests of 100 gig. And in every sense, it oversaturated. Yes, there were slight differences there, like the AJA performance numbers on write being a little lower, and that was utilising just 3 of the SSDs in a RAID environment there. We didn't even RAID the whole thing. There was just no point. If you did RAID all of them together, I'm sure the internal performance would be great, but external performance, I was always going to be limited by that 10G, and there's going to be those of you that say, why didn't I stick in a couple of 5G USB adapters? But that's not how this arrives out the box. So it seems slightly dicey to start talking about that. Even on their own pages, they do highlight the performance numbers, and they're quite realistic. They talk about the right numbers there with a single disk or full population, and that's really about it. When we tested it in Plex, and we've got a dedicated Plex video coming, it performed extraordinarily well. Yes, we are reaching the point now with bandwidth where 1 gigabit Ethernet can present something of a throttle to the most dense 4 and 8K media, but that aside, the hardware we've got here did a damn fine job, and ultimately, as a flash NAS system, it's very hard to fault. Yes, I didn't like the single Ethernet port, that's a bummer. I don't like that there isn't ECC, but again, staying within the remit of the price tag, this is phenomenal. And keep in mind, I defy any of you in the comments to build this. Build me a NAS this small with 8 M.2 NVMe slots with 10 GBE for this price tag and make it like this with the software included. And remember, as mentioned earlier, you can slam on Unraid, you can slam on TrueNAS, you can do what the hell you want in terms of software, and they'll support your hardware. It's very hard to fault this. And as their first entry, no doubt into an expanding range of SSD systems, I can't really fault it for the target audience. Now, We're going to be talking a little bit more about Terramaster towards the end of the first week of September. They're in partnership with another brand at IFA in Berlin, and we're over there, myself and Eddie, covering a few different brands, a few of the new stuff coming up. We will be talking a little bit more about this and another Terramaster NAS very, very soon. Also, we are going to be giving away one of these on the NASCompare Inner Circle and YouTube membership. So if you are in the YouTube members, if you are in the NASCompare Inner Circle on Ko-Fi and Patreon, you're going to hear a notification very, very soon to get hold of one of these in a giveaway. We've got one of them to get rid of, and it could be you. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. There's a written review linked in the description below with further testing that we performed on this, so I recommend you check that out. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.